Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Play podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Locals. And you can support me on Subscribestar, Locals, and Buy Me a Coffee. So this is the first part of our series unpacking my speech about the culture war on the Old Glory Club. This was partly inspired by other people recommending or requesting that I go on a deeper dive. For example, Dave the Distributist in his stream, and then Paul Fahrenheit on the Old Glory Club stream. And then Logos and I were also talking about future content collaborative work. And he's like, hey, why don't you just jump on this? And I'm like, well, yeah, you're right, because people have been asking me about this. So now we're here. So yeah, Logos, since you sort of have the man with the plan here, why don't we just start with you here?
Sure. I think the best way to start this is to clue the audience in about how we got here to this topic, basically, because our first stream was actually going to be about education, because that was one of the big takeaways you got from this, and we're going to get there. This tension you see between the right and education is a problem, and that's going to be one of our bigger culminating streams. But when I was asking you about some of the hard questions that might plague the right and education, like how are we going to usurp the state certification processes in left-wing states? What are you going to do about college certification? And all the things like that. How do you stop faculty subreption, where you think that the institution's explicitly right-wing, but left-wing faculty like come in or become left-wing over time and start changing the values. This happens to Christian private schools. Things like that happened, and we started talking about this, and eventually it got to the point where it became clear that when you're talking about education, you're not talking about education as an institution the right is fighting with in the current year. You're talking about a principle of education and what it should look like should society no longer exist as it does. And so the big disconnect that I saw between basically what your audience's concerns might have been at the Old Glory Club and where your head's at now is you're thinking of a post-collapse society as far as the discussion goes, and they're thinking of winning the culture war. And so I went, okay, hold on now. Like this, a big part of your speech was this question of, where should we put our faith in the culture war? How should we look at it? How should the right understand it? And so it occurs to me that we have to answer this question, is the culture winnable, or should we start preparing for post-collapse? We've got to answer that long before we get to things like economy, technology, education, and all the other stuff coming down the pipe later as we do more of a deep dive into this talk. And that brings us to here. So let's talk it out. Let's make it explicit, all the implicit stuff.
Right. So, okay, let's start with defining what the culture war is. So in the speech, and I'll reiterate the basic premise here, the culture war is a unwinnable conflict because it is a frozen conflict led by counter gangs controlled by the deep state. So these are two words from geopolitics. The first one is frozen conflict, and the second one is counter gangs. A frozen conflict is where there is not any actual current fighting, but the resolution to hostilities has not fully been achieved. So, for example, a classic example is the 38th parallel North-South Korea, which the war was ended with an armistice, not a peace treaty. In theory, it could start up anytime. Also, classic examples would be Nagorno-Karabakh with Armenia and Azerbaijan, in Moldova with Transnistria, this weird like time capsule Soviet-esque society. And nations would want these in place so that at some future date they could utilize this conflict for their own benefit. So the case of Russia would be in Transnistria, and Korea is just how the chips fell when the war ended. These are conflicts that you can't actually win by a direct action or by a coup de main because they're frozen. As soon as you change the meta, they then become an active conflict, and it's something else entirely, which in the context of the United States would be an actual shooting civil war. That would be moving from a frozen conflict to hot. And then second of all, counter gangs. Now, while he didn't invent the concept, because the idea of having somebody fight with your enemy under a false pretense to eventually betray or disperses momentum is not a new idea. In modern terms, it was kind of formalized by Frank Kitson in his suppression of the Mau Mau in Kenya, where he created parallel black nationalist groups to dilute the power of the Mau Mau so the British could win. And that's why you have people who, in like the culture war of the Democrats and the Republicans, or, you know, the people that are, well, what was that? The dark web, right? Isn't that what they called, like Jordan Peterson and some of the other guys' logos? Yeah.
The intellectual dark web. Yeah.
Intellectual dark web. Yeah. That's why all these people don't actually have solidarity with the people that supposedly represent them. I sort of realized this when I was looking at the Christian part of the culture war. Because there's all sorts of Christians that respectable people like, you know, William and Craig and others will just routinely throw under the bus. And it's like, well, wait, you know, you're supposed to be representing our interests here, and you're just routinely allying or showing class solidarity, if you will, you know, with your atheist peer professors. Well, because all along it was just about getting into the university club. So of course you had to be nice to the atheist professors, but you didn't have to be nice to your fellow Christians. And eventually all this starts adding up, and you see this also in politics. And I'm like, okay, these people actually have interests that are independent of the people they claim to be the voice of. So, right, I don't remember having, you know, even when I was more of a normicon, even when I was more of a libertarian, I don't remember designating any of those people to be voices that spoke on my behalf, but nonetheless, they purported to do so. And many people go along with it. And then the other thing is, they get along awfully, you know, they don't really deliver the knockout blow, right? And so they're also doing things that are diametrically opposed. Like, for example, right? Let's look at the countergang on the left. Almost all modern socialist parties in the Western world are in favor of immigration. That's suicide from a socialist perspective. Why might that be the case? Especially since from like time immemorial up to 1980, all socialist communist parties opposed open borders. Well, because they're countergangs and they don't really serve any broader socialist goal. There was a saying that the conspiracy people on the right would say that Lenin wanted to create fake peace movements in the West in order to then undermine the Western military and defeat them. But that sort of level of subversion was not unique to the Russians. It was also done by the capitalist West. And so it's a staged fight. The factions involved are controlled op by countergangs. Now, not necessarily everybody involved, but that's not the point, right? If you have a few key influential people who are and can convince the majority of people that they're not, that's all that matters. And the conflicts are just unending. The culture war has been going on since roughly 65, and it was created in order to break up working class American solidarity. So, for example, right before he died in 76, the musician Phil Oakes was saying, you know, if we're going to have a revolution against the military-industrial complex and capitalism, we don't need a divided culture. We need a united culture. Exactly. That's why they did it. And that's the main takeaway for the culture war. It is a sideshow to distract us from the class war, which was lost a long time ago.
Okay, and this brings us to, I guess, a sequence of questions that, when answered, will hopefully prime the audience for the next set of topics. Because we're going to be focusing this one on MAGA, basically, and how hard the right, or should I say the dissident right, you know, your perspective of it, should hitch the wagon to that movement. So here are some questions to consider. Is MAGA basically one of these counter gangs that's pretending he's not, or is the MAGA movement, at least the top of it, you know, serious about actually trying to end this thing? That's number one. Number two, assuming MAGA is serious, do they have the firepower to end this thing? And then number three, assuming MAGA is serious and they have the firepower to end this thing, is this thing in some sense out of MAGA's control in the long term? Maybe the fuse has been lit and our society's too far gone, or maybe there are fundamental assumptions in most MAGA that, you know, like socialists have, for example, with immigration. You might say that the MAGA movement, and you probably will say this, has enough capitalistic assumptions that err against itself too, in the sense that maybe capitalism and hyper-technological focus is antithetical to Christianity or spiritual notions. So those would be the three questions, reviewing real quick. Is MAGA serious? If they are serious, do they have the firepower? If they are serious and have the firepower, is it too late? And or are there assumptions that will undermine them from within? So I guess we can take those in order.
Yeah. So the first one. Now this is actually interesting, right? Because on the one hand, you could interpret MAGA as a counter gang, but you could also interpret it as Caleb Maupin has, sort of a deep state civil war, where within the elites at the top, there are real issues that are coming to the fore that are leading to, that could lead potentially to a civil crisis. Now, from I guess the point of view of us, the observer, does that really matter? Does that really make a difference? Because then the question becomes, if it isn't a counter gang, but really an elite civil war, then what does Trump represent? Because obviously he has a populist appeal, but I think a lot of that is political, right? So think of like Julius Caesar. He played the populist card, but what did Julius Caesar really want at the end of the day? Complete absolute power and the dissolution of the republic. So I don't necessarily know if that's a principled position or just a means to get power, whatever that might look like. So I would say I don't really know. It's probably one of those two. I don't think it's really organic in the sense of like of the people. I think it's either a counter gang or maybe a little more likely a civil war between the deep state. But I will say this in favor of the counter gang theory. In light of the recent attempt on Donald Trump's life last week, there's a lot of irregularities which make you wonder, was this whole thing simulated? And if it was, like, what is up with that, right? That's just weird. So that's one. Two, is it serious? Let me put it this way. When Trump was in the White House from 2016 to 2020, he really didn't do much of what he said he was going to do. Now, a lot of his defenders said, oh, well, that's because he was fought tooth and nail by every part of the establishment, which was true. But then the question would become, okay, well, why didn't he just, I don't know, burn his political capital and just go all in and just start throwing people out? You're going to get a variety of answers on that. The real test would be to see if he gets reelected and then actually put some teeth behind what he said he was going to do. But if we just look at his first term, I don't think MAGA's all that serious. There's a lot of things Trump said. He didn't build the wall, and he didn't make Mexico pay. So I know that was electioneering, but still. And then lastly, do you think they have the power? Well, that's an interesting question too, because let's just say they are serious hypothetically, and hypothetically, do they have the power? The actual generals within the U.S. military, I think, would probably be more establishment in favor of Biden, or whoever the establishment candidate is. And then if we look at what would they do with the military side with MAGA? Again, not sure. There's been a lot of liberalizing of the military over the last couple decades, which makes a sort of naive conservative bias within the military, I think, somewhat questionable. But then you have to ask yourself, the gun owners of America, will they stand up with Trump? I think if we step back all the way, whatever Trump's motives are, I think what MAGA is actually doing is it's a way to bait out potentially dangerous people and have them self-own like January 6th. That's what I think is actually going on. That doesn't necessarily make it a counter gang, because the guys that I'm talking about who do this sort of, pardon the joke, play 4D chess.
Okay. So that leads into, I guess, the next question then. I mean, it seems like, let me try to summarize all you've said here. It seems like your warning for the right in hitching itself to the MAGA movement really is it's unclear if the people heading it actually care about the things they care about. It's unclear if they are actually, serious about winning. And it's unclear even if they have the firepower to win. And each of these things brings with it its own set of problems. So, like you said, at the very end, MAGA could be baiting people into a trap. So let's suppose the dissident right starts hitching its name to MAGA and starts trying to build institutions through them. That could make them a target, basically, a lightning rod for the establishment. If they hitch their wagon to MAGA and MAGA gets into a war with the establishment and it crushes everybody associated with MAGA because they don't have the firepower, sucks to be them. So they could be bait. It could be serious, but they could be outgunned in whatever war that's trying to be brought about here. And also, I mean, what we didn't really get to, I think the fourth question is whether there's something in MAGA that is just counterproductive to the whole thing.
Yeah, I could jump in on that real quick if you want.
Sure, yeah.
Well, this also gets to the point, what exactly is MAGA? Because ultimately what I think MAGA represents is a sort of sense of a lot of boomers, a lot of red state conservative Americans to just own the libs. They kind of don't care anymore. And I'll give you a good example. So like Keith Preston, he grew up with a bunch of Bible Belt fundamentalists, and he's like, he couldn't believe how many people he grew up with voted for Trump, who was a notorious philanderer and adulterer who condemned Clinton in the 90s. And I'm like, it's simple, Keith. They just want to own the libs. But what does that do? It gets you kind of have a choice to make. Are you going to stick to your principles, or are you just going to lean into the moment and just own the libs? And what that does is, most importantly, it's kind of a ratchet. It's like, okay, well, are you going to just own the libs or stick to your principles? Because if it can get you to give up on your principles, you become easier to control, right? It's those principles which you putatively held that made you harder to control. And it also leads to cognitive dissonance, which leads to all sorts of other issues. So I think really MAGA is too inchoate yet. It's just this groundswell of resentment and anger that has not reified.
That makes sense. And we'll also get into some of the other elements of MAGA later with the economy, technology, the obsession with growth that are also counterproductive to right-wing movements. But those will be in future talks. For now, I think your position's pretty clear on why the right should be wary of MAGA and probably shouldn't jump in, headfirst into this alliance, at least the intellectual dissident right that you're a member of. I mean, a lot of the rights jumping in after the assassination attempt with both feet, I've been seeing with my own eyes. Everybody in my friend groups who were even remotely right of center, they're just like buying all the MAGA shirts. They're just like, they're done. They're in the tank form after that. But to your audience that you expect to be more cautious, more intellectual, look at the long game, this is the worries you have for them.
Right. So to put this in a nutshell, the problem with MAGA, as I see it, is there's too many unknowns. Now, part of that is it's a newly developing movement, which is not fully crystallized yet. So that's not necessarily the result of any malice or anything like that. But then there are just a lot of secrets. And, if I'm going to join a movement or become a part of a business or an institution, I don't want secrets. Secrets to me indicate you're hiding something, and that means something sus. So I just don't go in for that. And the other thing is, if we just look at the previous failed movements of the right before, especially January 6th, this is classic failure to understand Sun Tzu, right? If you know yourself, you know your enemy, you do not for the result of 100 battles. Sun Tzu says, if you don't know yourself and you don't know your enemy, you're never going to win. And that's where the right's at right now. It's not only that I'm concerned about MAGA, the right is not yet in a position where it is feasible to act intelligently.
Okay. So with that setup out of the way, let's, I guess, move on to the next broad phase of the conversation, which is what the right should be doing. So if it shouldn't be trying to fight for the institutions, if it shouldn't be trying to hitch its wagon to the strongest political movements and trying to wrestle control from the left, so to speak, where do you see the goal of the dissident right being over the next, say, 5-10 years?
Right. So this is where a video that I put out a little while ago comes in that's really important, where I talk about the importance of of this is called Asimov Foundation, The Fall of Empires, Casual Stream 80. And, I said, if you look at the Roman world in 460, most historians then and now are focused on Majorian and Ricimer and the struggle for the imperial throne. Whereas Patrick had just died, at least one of the dates for Patrick's death is 460. And now, by the year 500, the Roman Empire in the West is completely gone, and all these political intrigues are meaningless. Patrick has laid a foundation that will lead to the what Thomas Cahill says how the Irish saved civilization. Now, at the time, I doubt very many people thought Patrick was doing anything important. I mean, missionary work would be considered important, as a part of the expansion of the Catholic Church, but just one more guy on the front, not this like center pivot of history, which it later became. And so what the MAGA represents is the trap of Rome, this idea that you just get sucked into the vortex, and then so many years later the empire's gone. It was all for nothing. Whereas what Patrick did out in the middle of nowhere, Ireland, was actually what was important for the next 400, 500 years of European history, though at the time, very few people would have perceived it that way. And so I view that these political struggles in much the same light. And then why that? Well, because I believe that collapse is coming. I've talked about it a lot here on this channel, so I'm not going to belabor it too much. There's a concept called ERLI, Energy Return on Investments, whereby if you have a ratio of 1-to-1 or 1 to less than 1, that's an energy sink and no longer a valid source of energy. All of our major energy sources, coal, natural gas, oil, have been on a downward trend for almost 100 years. The arrow has only slowed. No one has changed the arrow. So it's obvious what's going to happen if this trend continues, and it's basically a 100-year trend. So in 1930, you could get oil out of Texas for 1 barrel in, 100 barrels out. Texas doesn't really have a whole lot of oil anymore, not compared to what it used to. And, for like the EROIs for shale, it's like the best I found is 1 to 3, which is garbage. And the worst I found is less than 1 to 1. So shale's in trouble. And then furthermore, you got to pump in water with the shale fracking to then get the oil out. Well, where's the water going to come from? In a lot of cases, these are in desert areas. It gets complicated. So long story short, all the energy sources are tapped out. Nuclear is not a solution because even if people were building it, which they're not, you'd still have to get the uranium out of the ground, and that needs 880-ton earth movers, which, wait for it, are powered by oil or diesel rather. But so there you go. And of course, nobody is building these reactors. And so the problem is with the utopians, they think that the plan of energy independence that they have in their head is already being implemented somewhere by somebody, or will very soon be, though that's never been the case. And furthermore, why don't Russia and China do this? They don't have a green lobby. They don't have, quote, the Dems. It's a fantasy. These people just invented a fantasy to explain why we're not doing it. Because again, if it could be done, Russia and China would be doing it. You better know they would be. And so that's a huge reason. Demographic collapse, another one. There's no changing that. We're just going to go off a cliff, and there's just, when we're going to have the population, I think according to UN projections, by the end of the century, the whole world population will have more than halved. It's ridiculous. Like that kind of social upheaval will probably take down most of the world's governments. And whatever eggs you're putting in that basket are going to be bye-bye. So for those two reasons alone, I think that what the right needs to do is develop a mindset capable of navigating those two crises, the energy crisis and technological collapse, and the demographic crisis. The demographic crisis is more certain. We definitely know that's coming, and we have a pretty good idea when. So anything not spent on that is basically going to be wasted. And then I guess the third point I'll make is this. Any action taken, any money spent within the cash nexus will eventually just disappear. I mean, think about all the legacy of the silent gen and the World War II gen. They're gone. It's like they never existed because, they die, their house gets sold off, and that's it. Done. Didn't exist. And so if this whole system is imploding, anything built inside of it, according to the principles of the system, will also go with it. So in order to survive technological collapse and demographic collapse, you have to envision a new way of doing things such that what you build doesn't disappear when the system collapses. All very challenging problems.
Okay, so I guess this gets to the next problem. I'm trying to figure out how best to articulate this. I think what we talked about in stream is just this vague concept of, does the right understand the culture war, or what does the right understand about the culture war? I think we've covered a bit about this, but let's think of it this way. What should the right understand about the culture war, in the sense that what are they doing now, and what actionable things should they be doing weeks, months from now, to start pivoting into thinking the way described, in terms of, I don't know, financial planning, in terms of networking, in terms of all this stuff, because we both believe that, the real bad stuff is going to start happening, I don't know, I'd say within 5 years from now. So it's not like time is unlimited here. It's of the essence. And so I think a big call to action is going to have to be a large part of what we're talking about. So what are the next steps?
Right. So someone might say, okay, the culture war might in fact be a frozen conflict led by counter gangs, but it might be a simulation. But it's still happening and it still has effects. That's true. So a sort of like rear guard defense action might be justified in certain cases in order to sort of protect and hedge yourself against what's going on in the broader culture war, in the same way that one might hedge against, a flood or a thunder or a hurricane, right? You're not trying to like beat it or win it or fight it and take it over. You're just hedging against it. But what really has to happen is a fundamental change in perception of what it means to be right wing. So the thing that I keep coming back to is Baudrillard's simulation. So you look at something that's considered right wing, and then you just sort of like, okay, I got it. This is perfect. So when you have AI, okay, one of the people who say that AI is going to replace humans and start thinking, they'll keep describing how, well, look, AI can ape human behavior better and better and better and better. And we eventually ape it so well that, it'd be very hard to tell the difference between the two. That's not the same as thinking. There's a fundamental mistake going on here, that there's an action. Well, there's two mistakes. There's an action that's taking place that has a higher order effect that is being ignored. And then second of all, there is an action taking place within a sequence of other actions for which disengaging it would make it a meaningless concept. So one of the other great speeches by Last Things about Guattari is the idea of deterritorialization, where you have a place called the territory, and then it's broken apart piece by piece, which is called deterritorialization. And then the goal is to re-territorialize it. The problem is, if you have a process and you take out each piece of that process, and then you ignore the context in which each piece comes from and just mix and match and move them around, then you kind of create this complete discontinuity between things. And so what the right has done is become a simulation in a deterritorialized environment of what would be classically be right wing. So how can I make this simpler? Well, a real right wing, a real heroic mindset would be Ulysses. So at the end of the Odyssey, what does Ulysses do after he gets home and defeats the suitors? Well, the people that were loyal to him, specifically the two men that were loyal to him, who are the swineherd and the cowherd. Well, he was gone for 20 years. He gives them properties. He gives them palaces and he gives them wives. He rewards them for their loyal service. He doesn't give this BS whataboutism with regards to paying your dues, going through the system, which is what you're going to get from right-wing conservative boomers today, or almost anybody on the right. And that's fundamentally why they're not right-wing, because Ulysses, that was the proof. The loyalty to his cause for 20 years was the proof. You didn't need to do anything else. The fact that that still isn't enough, and you have to add in X extra steps, means that people on the right don't really understand what it means to be right wing.
Okay, that seems like a necessary condition for being right wing, right? So if you fail to reward based loyalty, um, you know, you're not right wing. If you put a bunch of extra conditions on it, you're not right wing. Um, so let's try to spin it positively for a second. So trying to go with the Ulysses analogy, what is it to be right wing? To whom should we be giving property? I'm not talking about in the abstract. I mean, like, really, who are the loyal people here? How should we be distributing property? And how should we do that to bulwark against a decaying society, as if we're, say, Patrick by the fall of the Roman Empire?
Yeah. So yeah, the couple ways we can look at this. I think most generally, most broadly, the right represents the organic. So organic realities, and then organic social structures. So if we look at Aristotle, he'll look at nature, because I think he's by profession a biologist. But then he'll talk about, okay, well, humans are social creatures. He says that only gods or animals can live solitary lives, so they have to create social structures. Now, for him, like things like the city state or the family are not, well, they might be constructed, they're not synthetic, right? There are real needs that need to be met by the creation of certain institutions, which, unlike say the natural order, don't just exist. They have to be built and maintained. That's one thing. And then the left, by all the alternative, is synthetic. So anything that is unnatural. So basically, the entire machine age is basically leftist by default, because it seeks to impose this synthetic existence on everyone and everything else. And so that's more broadly what I would call right and left, most broadly. And then, of course, how do you know who to reward? Loyalty and all those things. Part of it is that there's a lot we just can't take for granted anymore. You and I talked about this before, Logos. After 1945, we pivoted hard in the United States from a liberal arts education to a STEM-oriented or finance-oriented education system. And so a lot of the principles that I would have assumed or used to be second nature to most people are just not. And since the one book that most of these people are probably at least a little familiar with is the Bible, more than even say any of the other traditional texts, just read that to figure out who is rewarded by God, who is not rewarded by God, who is rewarded by the good kings, versus who's rewarded by the bad kings. That's the best way to do it. And we could say that loyalty is this. Loyalty is standing by a cause or a principle, even if it is against your self-interest to do so, and suffering for that cause. So someone is loyal. Now, that doesn't mean if you don't suffer, you're not loyal. You might just be living in a peaceful, prosperous time. That's fine. But like when the rubber finally meets the road, what defines loyalty? And we can go back to the story of Ulysses and his swineherd and cowherd. The 20 years he was gone, the suitors, they were rough customers. They could have killed him if they wanted to. So to stand by Ulysses and again, they weren't even nobility; they were animal husbandmen. So that's loyalty. And then what does the right need to do? Literally, this is what I'd say. If we look at the world outside and we look at a tree and a river versus a strip mall or an airport, what makes the two different? Well, the first two exist as a natural consequence of nature itself. There's no active human effort to make sure that we have trees and rivers. They just are. Strip malls and airports only exist because somebody thinks they make a profit off of it. That's why they exist. And so if we want to look at the terms of collapse, we need to ask ourselves, when the money runs out, what will actually be left? What are the kinds of things that will be left? Well, there won't be airports, so they won't be gone. They won't be left. And so you have to ask yourselves, what could you possibly build that could last when the money dries up? That's the really $1 million question.
Okay, so it sounds like, in a sense, you're addressing this to several different people. Um, on the one hand, we actually talked about this behind the scenes, right? You said there's roughly two stratifications of people, say at the conference. There are people that are making it in the current system, and there are people that are really struggling in the current system. The people who are struggling by the current system, especially because they're sticking to principles, say they lose their job because they don't get the jab. Let's say they refuse to lie on their job applications that demand they have experience, which most feasible people would never have for entry level job. Things like that. They have principles. They won't lie for them. They won't abandon them. Um, so they're one target audience that you're going to want to address with this. And the other people are the ones that are making it, doing well with the system, so on. So I mean, it sounds like you're saying the people doing well in the system need to find somebody. They need to find laborers. They need to find local people, and they need to find people to invest in. But you also said that investments are temporary, in the sense that once the system collapses, any investments in the system collapse with it. So you're saying something like they need to find things outside the system to use to invest in people who um, basically need the hand up to prepare for what's coming. So that's something you're saying to one group, and the other group. This is where I'm a little foggy. The group that don't really have anything, that need to worry about this whole question of due paying versus allocating property and resources and so on. They don't have anything to allocate. They need to be doing something. So it sounds like you're saying something like they need to find a way to make themselves found by these people, so these people can find each other. Is that kind of what I'm getting at here, or you're getting at here?
Well, okay, so a little bit. I think the first part, the halves, you definitely did a really good job of describing who I was pitching to. The have-nots, I'll say something about them shortly, but I think basically this ties again into the Ulysses analogy. Yeah, loyalty needs to be rewarded. If these are right-wing anons that have been holding the line on these principles, then you need to just take that direct course of action and just ennoble them like you kill Ulysses did. That is the proof. You don't need any more proof. They've been sticking to their principles, and this is what's happened to them. Now, to them, what I'd say is hold tight. There's not a whole lot they can do. The best they can do is disengage and hit the dirt and just wait. Find a vault tech vault and wait till you can open it up.
Okay. I think it's starting to become clear now, like what your immediate vision for the right is, and how one thinks the world is right, how you prove one to be right wing, and so forth. Um, okay, so we're trying to um, redirect resources into loyal people who are basically going to help you when shit starts hitting the fan, so to speak. Um, so the next question, I guess, is dealing with rewarding them in ways the system can't destroy as the system goes down with it, and also avoiding, I guess, leftist prying eyes. Because the people who make it, generally, the more you make it in society, the more eyes you have on you in terms of how you spend your money, resources, and so on, which causes kind of like a problem from two sides. Right-wing anons usually have fairly good reasons for wanting to stay anonymous, community issues, family issues, things like that. And so getting unwanted, I don't want to say unwanted, getting sudden, surprising, let's put it that way, boosts from people who are making it could draw attention to themselves in ways that can undermine the reasons they were keeping their anonymity. Whereas on the other end, because a lot of the people you're talking about are very principled people, but they are private, they are anonymous, it would be a genuinely difficult endeavor to find them in the first place, to allocate things as they need to. So how do we solve the problem here? How do we solve the matchmaking problem, I guess?
Well, that really is the problem. A long-term solution to that problem is these people all moving together. Somehow, like I said, the Lulberts could do it with the Free State Project, but you know that's quite a ways off. So any sort of networking would have to begin with online, right? And I think especially if you went to the conference, that also helps too. You kind of know who is a have and who is a have not. It's really not that hard to tell. And the haves are usually a bit older, though not always. The question then becomes, what will incentivize the haves from their position of comfort to do anything about it? Because right now they're not. And that is also the $1 million question. I think ultimately it's going to be some sort of existential crisis, which unfortunately might be too late.
That's true. Thinking constructively as well. I guess the question that I'm still faced with is what should they do about it that won't be eroded by the system when it collapses? So my immediate thoughts about this, given our discussions, would be something like, I don't know, trying to build. You said something like the Free State Project, and so I'm thinking things like that. That I guess could be new places people want to move to. Where people can work together, get their needs met. It sounds kind of like utopian when you think about it. It sounds like a hippie commune or something. But it also sounds like Dave's Benedict option, right? Like actually, removing yourself from society, and building parallel institutions and all that stuff. So I mean, there's a left wing ring to it. There's also a right wing ring to it. And so it sounds like these guys need to. So I guess that's a paradox, right? Because the people that have stuff invested in the system, you're saying need to start decoupling it from the system, start advertising these projects to people that can come and work them. The trick is, if you decouple from the system too quickly, you lose the benefits you get from it. Let's say capital gains, interest, things like that. Like you have the resources to spend on this in theory because you have been and remain invested into the system, which allows you to kind of withdraw these funds. The quicker you pull out, the more you lose them. On the other hand, if you don't do this, like you're saying, this is probably going to happen quicker than people realize. And so if you don't decouple from the system fast enough, let's say there's a general stock market crash, and all your capital gains just go kaput along with your invested principal to begin with, it'll be too late. How would we suggest people thread the paradox?
Well, I think there's an interesting point you made, right? It said it sounds hippie. See, that's the problem, right? That what I'm talking about wasn't unusual throughout all of European history when we actually had intact communities. This is exactly how an intact community would be run, whether it was a Greek city-state, a Celtic village, a medieval village, early modern. But we're so individualistic and libertarian that it sounds impractical. But that was how, which is strange, right? Because for people that want to return to tradition and live in a more traditional way of life, they just don't want to do that, which is like literally the core element of that. And then the second point is, how do you avoid the heat? Well, first of all, I think you could probably look at the geography of North America and figure out there's going to be certain places that are probably not going to have a lot of violence for various reasons. They're hard to get to. They don't have large urban centers. They're mostly homogeneous, et cetera, et cetera. Somebody should do a study on that to figure out which are the most likely. You can say blue, like dark blue would be like least violent, and like bright red would be like New York City, just a war zone. Get out, and then just try to and then visit these places once you've marked them on the map and see which ones are the most suitable for a community building effort. And that would be one start. Second start would be, I think it depends on how you want to market this, right? Because the heat, if it's just viewed as a sort of like religious or cultural First Amendment thing, like what the Amish do, then you probably wouldn't get a lot of heat. And that's why not getting involved directly in politics is so important for this, because if you do, well, you just brought a whole lot of heat onto you. And then 2 or 3 rather, and this could be a video all in itself. I think that once you've properly internalized the principles that I'm talking about, you will be able to, quote, hide in plain sight, in this sense that the Eye of Sauron can look directly at you, but either A, not see you for what you are, or not really be able to understand what it's seeing. Because, so for example, let's use the example of the Soviet Union, right? If the state says certain things can't exist or don't exist that we know do, and you lean into that really hard, they're going to have a hard time finding you, because their very own search routines to find you will be screwed up by them believing certain things to be true that aren't.
Okay, so I guess to make this really actionable and to wrap this in kind of a bow, because theory is good, and we get the comment a lot, Todd, that we are very theory oriented people, and a lot of people want action. I mean, especially if time's running out and things like this. So to interpret what you're saying and try to make it as actionable as possible, here's what I'm getting. Let's take Dave's what is it called, basket weaving groups, right? You get these local basket weaving groups in the event that you can't meet at conferences and things like this. So it sounds like what you're saying is local basket weaving groups need to get together and not just hang out and whatever. They should start making actionable plans in the near future to see who has what resources, who can spare what, and try to find safe havens that may be free from violence in the near future around them. And they need to start making an eye to look toward building these things. They should not advertise them as hyper-conservative or anything like that. They should advertise them as, roughly religious communities like the Amish, things that, wouldn't be seen as too threatening, Ruby Ridge or, anything like that. And so that's the first actionable plan. And I think, I guess I do think that makes sense. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
Well, the only thing I'll add, and only as a preface to what we'll get to later, and I understand why people would want to move from theory to action, because ultimately you just can't think your way out of a problem. You do have to do something at some point. To prepare the way for our education episode, what we have to do is have a revolution in education, because again, the reason why the right always loses is it doesn't read Sun Tzu. It doesn't know itself, and it doesn't know its enemy. Partly that's the result of education, especially the not knowing yourself part. So in order to actually take actions that will achieve the results that are intended by the user, you first have to know yourself. And that's what philosophy is. That's what when you went to Plato's school, it said, know thyself. So there's a whole sense in which people who are not materialists, right? They say, oh, I believe in God, I believe in a higher power, still functionally act like materialists in this one sense. They would say that, yeah, there's a soul. They would even say they believe there's a soul. But in part, what I would argue is that because of the system that they live in and conditions of behavior they've become acclimated to, they don't act as if they have a soul. And by this, I mean they don't act in ways that are calculated to induce or produce spiritual growth in a way that, say, any Christian of any denomination 100 years, 200 years ago would have done. And again, that's not entirely their fault. That's partly a lack of education. But there's so much meta, and this is only just getting us ready for the education stream.
Okay, so I guess let's try our best at summarizing all of this, because we moved through quite a bit over the course of the talk, and to make sure we don't forget anything and we've given everything its proper due, I guess let's just move through it. So the first thing is there is a disconcerting tendency from the right to try to hitch itself to the popular political movement, because it thinks that it can try to wrest power from the left in terms of education, in terms of the economy, in terms of all sorts of different aspects. In many ways, you think this might be a trap. So either the MAGA movement isn't really serious and it's using these people for Caesarite power, but it's not ultimately trying to hurt them. It just doesn't care about them. Worst case scenario, it's actually trying to bait them out, use them as a trap, like say January 6th. It could be drawing the right into a war that it may not have the resources to win. And even if the MAGA movement does start, taking traction, there's some fundamental assumptions it might make about the system, how the economy should work, technology should work, etc., that are so anathema to right-wing thought that the right would die soon after joining them anyway, because it just kind of gets roped into the machine. So for that reason, the right should avoid MAGA movement. It should avoid using its financial and political and otherwise capital to get entangled in this mess. And for various reasons, we should assume that no matter what happens to MAGA, it looks like the country is headed for problems, big problems. So if the country's headed for big problems, what's the right supposed to do about it? So after getting things clarified here, first things first, you have to reorient what it means to be right wing. It doesn't mean succeeding in some capitalist economy to own the commies or the libs. It means refocusing on the local community, basically. Interestingly enough, Sargon talked about this on a recent stream with Tim Pool. What is an alternate vision from liberalism to conservatism? In Sargon's view, which I think you'd agree with, is fundamentally reorienting your view about society and society itself to kind of prioritize local relationships, local accountability, and things that move our sphere of responsibility from the center outward. And so what does that mean? That means, economically speaking, that means helping people that are struggling because they're not willing to compromise their principles in the current system. It also means looking to build out the system into safe havens, not investing in things that are going to die when the system collapses, but trying to build offshoots that are far enough removed from the system and its effects that they could sustain after the empire collapses. Let's say, like your example of Patrick from Rome. So how's the right to do that? The right is to do that by gathering in the local communities where it can, where it can't gather in the yearly conferences, gather in the basket weaving groups, like Dave is trying to get people to set up, and so on. Don't just look at local affairs in the present. Try to use these groups to network, coordinate resources, who has what, who can do what. Figure out safe places by each local group that can meet to build the ark, as somebody said in the chat. And then there was the very last part, which I guess I don't remember very well. You take us away. After that, what was the last part that's important?
The last part was there's a kind of functional atheism, and that people who when they say they believe they have a soul, they mean that. But because of the conditioning they've received, they don't act like they do. And so there's certain growth, spiritual growth, that they don't practice or do, or certain perspectives that they don't use, that if you did believe in the soul and were attuned with it, you would be looking at from that perspective.
Okay, so that makes sense. So that's what an individual can do as an individual. And so we've talked about the ways that people should engage in communities to solve this problem before things get out of hand. And then what you're talking about is basically a call to action for the individuals to kind of recenter how they look at the world. And I think to put this into context, the biggest thing was, when I chuckled and said it sounds like a hippie commune and made that joke, right? It sounds like that to people because people are so implicitly attuned to the materialistic context of society, even if they don't claim to be materialists. They think about the soul, they think about higher things and so on, but the idea of just moving to some hippie commune and getting away from technological comforts and the rat race of the economy, and so it sounds so anathema to them. Well, why is that? And so ultimately, without pushing people to do the kind of soul searching that needs to happen, people aren't going to orient to the right mindset that will basically carry them post collapse, when all the things they take for granted is like the right thing to do collapse with the empires. Is that kind of like the bridge between
bingo?
Comment and
that's
okay,
it.
good.
Yeah, bingo.
There we go. I like to make things clear for the audience. You know that. So
yeah,
I think that got it. Do you think I missed anything in the summary?
No, I think you did a really good job, Logos. I think this is a really great first episode. And the only one thing I want to say is, when we chose initially 5, but I don't think that necessarily means if we feel the need to, we won't go beyond 5, correct?
Oh, yeah, this is just getting you started for future content, because you're just asking, what should we do? And there we go.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you, Logos. And this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off. All right.